Just me. What happened? So, welcome to Brave Space Live, a show about anti-oppression, communal healing. Each week we pick a hard-hitting topic and dig right into the awkwardness. And today it's awkward because I'm sitting here by myself. Anyway, you all know me. I'm Tychelle. I'm a trained social worker, educator, and diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner. Today, Mel is out, but I did get a special guest. I dragged him over. So, and I brought one of our producers. He actually chose the topic for today, which is stolen museums. So I'm going to welcome my special guest and longtime friend, Benjamin.
Hi, Tychelle. Hello, everybody. So my name is Benjamin, he, him. I'm an avid arts enthusiast, Francophile, and New Englander turned New Yorker. And
when I told you to do this this intro, I was like, Francophile? He's so fancy.
Oh my gosh. Not too fancy. I just like all things French.
He really, really does.
I do.
Like all things.
Un peu de français aussi. Yeah.
Look at I'm fancy today. So I don't know if Ben was camera ready, but because Mel is out and he chose the topic and he was around, I was like, yes, Ben, you come talk about this. So first I want to ask you, what made you choose this topic?
So I love the arts. They've always been a part of my life. So museums in particular, at least for me, growing up, went to museum, constant field trip. No place, of course. I used to say trip growing up. And as I've gotten older, I've come to still value museums. And this might be dramatic to say, but Tychelle knows I can be dramatic, so this might be no surprise. I can remember going to see, it was the Alexander McQueen Savage Beauty exhibit at the Costume Institute at the Met, Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York City, and just it was so impactful and powerful. And as I've gotten older and maybe thinking museums more critically, I think museums have a stereotype of being these stale, old-fashioned, unchanging things. But if I give the example of the Met, we think, how are museums relevant? We think of the Met Gala. Yes, it's red carpet and fashion, but at the end of the day, it's a fundraiser for the Costume Institute at the Met. So they still play this role, and I think now, as we're looking, casting critical questions to things we love and even institutions, museums are no different. And I think it's only until recently that museums and their communities and patrons and people who work there are asking these same questions. And it's a really cool, I think, interesting topic that maybe can sound not accessible or maybe too academic, but I think we can make it accessible, and I'm excited to dive into that today.
Yeah, and I'll say, Ben has been a friend of mine for a while. We actually lived in New York City together. We did.
We've done some museum trips together. We've gone to the Costume Institute together. Yeah,
we did. We've gone up and down. We've gone to I think we went to a Met exhibit together, and it was pretty awesome. We've gone to lots of MoMA art galleries, all of the different things. Because when you're in New York, why wouldn't you go to the museum, the galleries and the museums near Dumbo and the Met and the Jewish Museum and all of the things. So yes, I'm excited to dive into this topic with you, but because neither one of us are actual professionals in this, we're so happy to have a guest star, or a guest speaker. I don't know if I'm gonna call her a star. I don't know if she's gonna
I think she's a star. Yeah, I would agree.
I think she's a star. Yeah. So let's bring on our special guest, Seema Rao, who's worked in museums for 20 years doing interpretive culture work and digital content development. She's found blogging at Museum 2.0, consulting at Brilliant Studio, and on Twitter and TikTok as ArtLustB. So let's welcome Seema Rao.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Oh my God. So we are novice in this area. Ben more than me. He will go listen every week. He has a studio or a play or a museum trip planned. I have only gone to we lived in New York together, and Broadway shows, museums, all of that, I would go if Ben was going. He would drag me to them. We saw My Fair Lady. We've seen many things on and off Broadway. So he loves all things arts, but I am a novice in this area. And I'll
That's
say,
awesome. That's awesome.
I'm sure I'm representing like the vast majority of people who go to the vast majority of people who patronize museums more than the people who are like experts in it. So we wanted to have you on.
Absolutely. It's a really small sector, right? Because museums don't have a lot of money, and they love to make, employees do at least 2 or 3 jobs at once. So we don't there's not a lot of us. And once many years ago, though I've now found this on my TikTok channel, most people don't I did a study. I was doing an evaluation. That means you're like marketing research basically. And people are like, other than like the cool stuff behind the scenes of museums, like looking at storage, people don't care how they run. They just don't, which kind of makes sense. Like, I don't really want to know what's happening. I mean, I almost
you don't want to know how the meat is made or how
that's what I was trying to say. I was trying to think of a nice way not to say how the sausage is made, but yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. Like, you don't think about it, right? You don't, and it doesn't matter to you, but it should. Like, I was thinking today, somebody was saying something about. Somebody sent me a media message from another institution. I'm only consulting now, but I was at the Akron Art Museum, and before that, the Cleveland Museum of Art. And so a lot of my friends send me media messages. And so there was a controversy at, and I think I can say it, the Guggenheim Bilbao had a big controversy that just came up, which is not about stolen artworks, but I think it's kind of germane. It's about an artist who stole imagery from another artist. So the artist who was the original owner's name is Day Day Studio. It's a African.
Oh, I did hear about this.
Yes, and I don't know if it's an African American or a Black European. I don't remember I know that they are Black, but I don't know where they are from. But they're showing Black American cowboys, and so somebody who was from the Basque lands appropriated the images without licensing them. And so I was talking to somebody, I was reading the statement about it, and a lot of people, and I was saying that, I was saying, oh, I did a TikTok about it, and she was like, yeah, did anybody get it? And I was like, no. And what I think they didn't get actually that their voice matters. That's the point they didn't get. I think they understood the thievery and like and I think like when you understand, like think of artwork being stolen, you get like, because you have stuff, right? And if somebody walked into your house and like took my earrings, I'd be upset. You get that part.
Right.
But I think you don't understand like the machine of it.
Right. So let me ask you a couple questions. So one, I would love to hear you started to talk, because we'll just jump into this topic like full force. So I wanted to just hear a little bit about like your background, what got you into working in museums, and then kind of maybe we can jump into the topic of like, I think most people don't even understand how museums run. We just go, we see stuff, and we're like wondering about it. And then the only time I think we think even deeper about it is when we read the plaques and where it's from, but not like how it got there. So anyways, let's start with what got you into museum work, why, and what you do in museums.
Sure. So I largely do interpretation, largely digital. Interpretation is the word museums use for content. So I write stuff, I do PR, I do anything that like tells a story about art. Okay. So often on a digital platform, so websites, kiosks, all that kind of stuff.
Those are the kiosks are very helpful, because I'm a very audible and visual person, and a plaque is like, that's real stale, but if I can listen to or read or like touch, so thank you for your work.
Thank you. We work so hard. You have no idea
it's so much history.
My audio tour, how you have to like parse it out. So thank you. So that's what I do. Now I consult on it. I have done it as like in-house, as the staff member, and now I'm doing it out of house. How I got into it, and I think actually this is part of the problem for museums. I got into it because I really liked art. I like the way it looks. And I think, Ben, you were saying, and I loved that show too, that Costume Institute show was just breathtaking, right? And it was beautiful. But, Costume Institute is a great example. I was sort of livid about this year's Costume Institute topic. It was the Gilded Age. The Gilded Age was a time when like America was in the dumps, because you had one of the second largest wealth disparity ever. The first largest is now. So we're like celebrating how crappy America is. Excuse my language. How bad America is. So I think that I went into it with that kind of the beauty of it and that kind of stuff. And it was really when I started working in museums, one of my first jobs at the museum I was teaching in the galleries, and I was working at a museum, and they had a big Asian collection, which is what I wanted to teach. And so I was teaching in the galleries, and Cleveland is actually very multicultural. So most people don't look at me and go, "Where are you from?" I mean, they do, but not like, it's not like some places in Ohio where this Cleveland is not like you picture cornfield, Ohio. And so somebody came up to me and he goes, "But like, what ethnicity are you?" And the person was also South Asian, and he had an accent. And I said, "Oh, my family's from India." And he said, "Oh, because I'm from Nepal." And I said, "Oh, that's cool." And then he said, "And this work has been stolen." And I was like, "Oh." I was like in graduate school, like 20 some years old. And I was like, "Ooh, they don't teach you this in graduate school. Like, what do I do?" And so I'd like messaged my boss, and I was like, "Oh, come on out." And she was real excited to have an ethnic person. And I do think like a thing my museums have a hard time with is they really want more people of color to come, but they're not sure how to do it. And they often think like they want to see their own stuff, right? So like you'll see like museums install a gallery full of Black artists to draw Black, visitors, often using white curators, things like that. So there's lots of problems.
Oh, I got a question about that later.
Okay, we'll talk about this.
I definitely had one of those.
So, but the thing I think that was important that I did back then, this is so many years ago, 20 years ago or whatever, I think that we used to think of museums as, I think Ben said it, like these kinds of on a platform places that don't change, and that we didn't have the right to ask where this was from. And now, actually, that institution is the Cleveland Museum of Art, and they have given back a lot of stuff, Cambodian stuff, Greek and Italian stuff. They've been very good about repatriation because, it isn't necessary. It's not a good thing to hold things that you shouldn't have. It's like legally bad. It's politically bad. It's personally bad, and so I've never been in the position where I literally have to repatriate anything, but I certainly have had to be there when people ask us questions about where it's from.
And I think
it's better to be in that position where you can say, "You know what, we're working on it."
Exactly. And I think that's a good question, in that when you first started talking, you were talking about like this ability to ask where things are from. Because one of the in preparation for this episode, I was watching a video about museums, and they were saying, "Oh, museums are public institutions," which a lot of them are, not all of them, right? There are some private museums, private collections, or anyway, maybe not museums as a whole. But like, I'm from Philadelphia, so there's the Barnes. The Barnes Museum is a private collection, so it's not technically a museum; it's a private collection. And the thing about Barnes is that he wanted it set up the way it was set up in his house, so everything is
it's crazy, right?
Also so little weird. And I've visited museums a lot. Like Philadelphia has one of the cities that has like more museums, and I also learned in preparation for the show that it's like where museums started, which is really interesting, but also still iffy about how it started, because then it went into like circus stuff. But the thought, going back to what you were saying, the thought that we can ask questions because it's a public institution just like never occurred. The only thing I know about museums is I should not touch the shit in there. Like that's the only thing I know.
Unless there's a special thing that you can touch.
Right.
But sorry, go ahead, Ben.
No, I was gonna say too, along with that, it's like almost like libraries where you're encouraged to like be quiet. Like, and I have fallen prey to like liking this and trying to enforce it and thinking, why do we have to be quiet if we're looking? Like, shouldn't talking and questioning be a part of this experience if these are public institutions that are made to enlighten the population and make broaden our minds and perspectives. So,
and museums are slowly changing the talking thing. They definitely don't want to be quiet. They have nighttime events. I've run a million very loud events in my career, but I would say, to go back to the thing, it doesn't matter where their money is coming from or how the collection started. It's a public institution. Right. Museums get funding. Any museum, almost every museum, like certain places that have a huge private donor, like the Broad in LA, maybe not, but most museums, even the Barnes, get money from a lot of federal funding sources, state sources, city sources. They are also all tax exempt. Therefore, they're all public. Right. And so we as the public have the right to ask. And the reason I think it's really important that we ask is that actually, if we don't and make them better, they're gonna fall apart.
Right. Keep doing what they're doing at the level that they're doing it, because nobody's questioning anything.
That's right.
Right. And it's just such an interesting thing because one of the things we're talking about, right, with this repatriation and all of this, to me, it's so interesting because I'm not like a Marvel fan, but I definitely watched Black Panther like 4 or 5 times. And that scene resonated with me so deeply in that I've gone in museums for years and I've seen ancient, African artifacts, and we don't know what it meant to that culture when it was there, who it belonged to, how it got from the people it belonged to here, right? And of course, with I think the origins of all things and what we look at in systems is that so much colonization and racism is involved very, very often and belonging to. So I just think that that's such an interesting talking point. But one of the things I'd ask too is like, in your work, why you think museums are and why you feel museums are like culturally relevant and something that we need in our society, and then how can we make them better? These are really big questions. I'm sorry, but
no,
like,
how can we make them better? I think they're actually tied questions. You said something about that. The scene in Black Panther. To me, I think part of the thing the reason I think that that's a really important thing for museum pros that was in there is that I don't know that people think of those things as theirs. So I taught in the galleries in Cleveland, which is the Cleveland Museum of Art is in a university setting, but there is a number of historic Black neighborhoods there, and I worked with a lot of those students. And, I think one of the things that I found really interesting is that a lot of those students, just because your skin is a certain color doesn't mean you resonate with any specific thing, right? So those kids didn't necessarily like our African galleries. They liked our Renaissance galleries. Or you like I don't necessarily, Indian art doesn't necessarily resonate with me, right? However, there's one really important part about African art for those students, which was the fact that it was stolen. And so even if it's not about what they're looking at, the history of it is incredibly important because it's the same history that they feel. Similarly, Indian art left India, and my family left India because of colonization.
Right.
So I think that one of the things and the reason that the history of these matter is because it's also about the history of power and people. They're all tied together. And I think a lot of the things that we're talking about, you say you do DEI work. I did it for many years in museums. It's so hard to talk about, and it's like it's not tangible. It's very hard. But if you can say that this is an object that has a terrible history,
right? And
the Congo is, the works from the Benin, the Congolese work that are in Belgium, and then the works from the Benin that are everywhere. Those are very clear examples. Then you can actually have a touchstone that allows you to talk about it in a constructive way. And then why do museums, why is this all culturally relevant? I will say that repatriation is important, absolutely. But those are historical works of art. If you're going to do anything and you want to be an activist about anything for museums and have your tax dollars go to the right place, I think a bigger thing is who's telling the stories and why are they telling the stories?
Exactly, yes.
Because that's a bigger problem that's beyond just the works that have to be repatriated.
Right.
It's about the fact that people of color are being misrepresented in galleries every day, all the time.
And I think that even leads into a question or thought that I have, which is with countries or maybe even own communities of people asking for objects back, there's a sense, and I think it's true, of this paternalistic or patronizing attitude of museums that we know how to protect this or display or store better than you, which seems like clearly a very white, colonialist, imperialist attitude. And I'm just curious, why is it, or where does it seem like there's this distrust that if a museum lets go of an object back to perhaps a local community or perhaps to a country of origin, that they think if we send it off to them, it'll be destroyed or gone forever, when perhaps those people or countries have shown we know this, it's a part of us, we promise we know how to be stewards of our own
creation.
Yeah.
Well, I think, none of us here, nobody who's listening can imagine their brains without colonialism. Our whole system is constructed in that, right? We cannot get out of the systems we're in. And I think about that all the time. I don't know how not to be a colonial subject. And so for that reason, in our construction of knowledge, like I was listening to a book on tape with my teenager the other day, and it was about ancient Egypt. And she said, this story that they're telling about ancient Egypt just seems like a story about the British people, because the way it was a British author, and he was saying, and then we learned from the Rosetta Stone, and we did this, and we did this. And she's like, I feel like there's some Egyptian people who would disagree. Exactly. And so we actually returned the book. But I think it's a good, that's why we can't imagine returning those works, because we see knowledge being constructed in a certain way. I think a good example is Nepali works. There was a huge outflux of Nepali works. There's been civil war, there's been challenges, but then before that, there was all kinds of situations. It was in Nepal, and so those works are finally being returned. But where they're being returned to and where the works came from were from religious sites. And religious sites don't have like humidity controls, and people touch them. You said you don't touch works of art. You have to touch them. Right? Yeah. And they might not be returned to the sites. They might go to temple, they might go to museums with the temple, but still, right? That's a different way of thinking of things than we do. Yeah. And that difference is so large, and our brains it like breaks our brains.
I think it's so interesting too, because in your question, Ben, and Seema, in your answer, it's also very infantilizing, right? From the standpoint of colonialists think that everyone else is childlike and doesn't know how. Even if you created it, they're like, well, you don't know how to handle these things. They're like, just because you put it in a fucking glass case and put a guard next to it does not mean you know how better. Because one, you're not, for some of the artwork, and I think about this in both movies and even when I've been in, especially like I went to the I call it the Blacksonian, which is the museum of the museum, the one in DC.
I want to visit that so bad.
And it's so hard to do because it's so many floors. I just was looking at this artwork and I understand that you shouldn't touch things because you want to preserve it, but just the thought that certain people know how to take care of things and certain people don't. Like, I always go back to, like, we taught you how to, for Indian people, we taught you spices, we taught you food maybe that you don't even use. And for people of color, like, we taught you how to wash. Like, you're going to tell us that we don't know how to use things that you took from us, that you are using in a way to display it, which I love museums for the way it can teach, right? And that teachers can use it and that we all can use it to learn from. But you can't say that this item that you have that's used for this thing that you're now just displaying and telling people what it's used for shouldn't be used for that thing. And I understand that too. The religious aspect of it is returning some of the objects to their original site won't work because specifically, not that it won't work, but that it's complicated because once it leaves, it's no longer sacred. So I understand that part of it, but that's not, I think, and I feel that it's not really up to the person who took it or the institutions that took it to tell people what they should. Let me put it in my museum. Let me share it.
Right? Who gets to decide? But I think that the problem also is that museums were founded on broken principles. Mm-hmm. And so what you're saying, you're right, that the role of a museum, and I will say, so many times in my career, I've had to turn down some project or not do something because we have to preserve the object. And you lose all accreditation if the object isn't preserved. So a museum's central role is about stuff and keeping it safe forever. Mm-hmm. The reality is that most of those things, like your spoon, wasn't made to be there forever, right? So you have this conflict inherent in museums that is exacerbated by colonialism, because museums really are about this idea that the colonial people will make sense of this disparate and complicated world that cannot be made sense of.
Right.
Right. So those are the two founding principles of museums, and they're both fallacies.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. It's just this thought that, because you can't say, and I think it makes me, what you say makes me think of like pyramids in Egypt, right? There are hundreds and hundreds and thousands of year old things, or the structure itself that has been preserved by people, right? So to, not everything is supposed, not everything is supposed to last forever, as you say, right? Some things are supposed to go back to the earth, and I think that's also a problem with colonialism, and I guess I would say even a central problem of museums is that you can, if you take care of the earth, you can return things to it and you can get anew, which I think, which is why I probably like more MoMA than anything else, the Museum of Modern. I want to see people who are doing things now as well. But I like history, but I don't know, like, who gets to tell that history, I think is also really, really important, right? Who's telling it, and are they telling it correctly? Do they have a tie to it? So, Ben, I don't know if you had another question for Seema, but you go ahead, and then I have another one that I really have been thinking about in preparation for this topic and overall.
I guess it's actually the question that's coming up for me now is something I think, Tychelle, you mentioned in terms of history. It's like, who is telling the story? So, and I think not just of what is written, but like folks such as you, Seema, like people of color who are in curator or interpreter roles. Like, how in your career, how have you seen that move and shift? Because I will say, I think if I could think of a stereotypical museum docent, it is this retired white woman, maybe with a nice like Hermes or vintage scarf like wrapped around.
Always a scarf, right? Always.
Like a flight attendant, but like
my friend who's always at the Met sends me pictures of the Met store with scarves. He's like, why this scarf? Why is she wearing that scarf?
Seriously.
Oh, but wait, I do have a question too, because this is a big one. What do you think, and if you were reimagining this like repatriation and returning art, how do you think that could best like work? Like, and you can the sky's the limit on what you think could be.
All
great.
right, I like the sky's the limit.
Yeah, sky's the limit.
Work. No, the sky's never the limit.
Exactly.
I think to answer Ben's question, but I think I'm answering them together. I think things have changed. They've definitely gotten better. I definitely know there's lots more. There's first of all lots more curators of color. There's many more interpreters of color, educators of color. I also think actually. The docents are classically volunteers, and who gets to volunteer? Who can volunteer at 2 o'clock on Tuesday, right?
Yeah,
and that's privilege. And so a lot of museums are moving away from docent teachers, because why are we outsourcing the most important service the institution does to the public, which is to teach, right? We are collectors of objects, but we are not storehouses. We are educators, right? So that you can't outsource that to freedom. So I think that in terms of like repatriation of collections, it's hard. I really believe I was remembering that a lot of museums like the Frick in Pittsburgh have casts of objects. That historically we now think of museums as being only places with authentic stuff, but lots and lots of museums had casts. And I do not think it's a bad thing I don't know that authenticity even matters to this generation anymore. It's not like I'm saying get rid of everything, but if something has a problem, then we have the ability to make 3D casts. And I love the idea of that. Like, for example, returning all the Benin bronzes to Nigeria and then having casts in those institutions. I also think my ideal is that then we also look at artists from those places and then bring those, but pay for them. Don't steal them, but pay for them. And I worked with an artist from Ghana on a show whose name is Rafai Zakari, and he's doing really exciting new work. I've looked at a lot of Ghanaian artists are really hot right now, and I see their work, and it's really exciting. So what if we focus on that as well? Because repatriation isn't just the only thing. There's also people who need jobs now. We need to make art.
That brings up a really good thought process that I had never thought about. Well, one blew my mind with the casting thing, which I think is amazing.
Same. That also. It shouldn't be like 3D printers. Duh. We have this. They can make anything.
Right,
Why
and
not?
It shouldn't be because when I was thinking about what that looks like, I never considered like a shell of something like this. That the 3D printing and all of that. We can do that, and you're right. I think it's more about what that object represents than it is about having the actual, like, I don't need, whether it's a spoon from 3 BC or if it's a cast to tell a story about the spoon from 3 BC matters as well. But I think the other thing that you talked about that's real, I think is really important, is that we look at other, and I think it kind of draws to this other thought process, in that we look at every other country as living in the past. So when we think about their art, we also think about Ben's like aha moment. I can see if you could see Ben's
my mind
face,
is right? my wheels are turning in my head. Yes.
Right. So we think about every other country as like a past and living in the past. So we think about the only things that they have to contribute are things from the past, and it's like, especially in like a savage, what we would call like a savage like way, like, oh, these are their objects and we use them for this thing or whatever. But I think that's so interesting, and I love that point that you brought up, and I never would have thought of it. So shouts out to you, and just this thought process that there are artists now doing amazing things now, and why not engage with them now and not just look at a museum as a historical site, but also a living, breathing thing about, collecting. And I think that's also the difference. This is the last point I was thinking about, is the difference between this cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation. If people get to own their own shit, then then I don't mind sharing with you. But if you come into my house and you take it, it feels a lot different than if I gave you a piece.
That's right. Also, like, hey, here, let me give you my earring.
Right.
I don't know how to get on a camera, but you know what I mean. Like I could do that. That is a valid way for me to share my stuff.
Right. And I say
you walk over and take it, not okay.
I always say to my husband, like, when I share food with him, like, he'll be like, oh, just save me a piece. And I'm like, I'm not giving you the last piece of my stuff, but I'm asking you, would you like to have some? But I'm just not going to give you the last of it because I want to have some for myself as well. So we have this whole conversation about this. He knows now not to ask me for the last piece or ask him to save him some. But I just think about, like, being able to share your own stuff, even if it's symbolic. Like, I don't care if I hand it to you and you hand it back to me. It's about the ownership and to be able to tell your own story. But I do think that the casting and what are artists doing now around the world, because we need to appreciate people for what they're doing now and what things look like now, and not just say, oh, this came from this broken down third world, as we call it, country or continent or whatever. This is now, this is what they're doing now. Right. Well, we will cast out an entire continent and be like, they're all living in huts. And you're like, no, they are more,
it is
agile
amazing.
It's
crazy. We are. I showed an artist whose name is Billy Zangawa, who is amazing and brilliant and does applique textile work, and lives in South Africa. And it's this beautiful. The work is Billy Zangawa is a self-portrait in her apartment, and in South Africa, it's like a high rise with like she has a beautiful like mirror in it. And I was talking to someone, and they're like, "Where was she?" I was like, "In Africa." Like, that's South Africa. And then we had another artist who was from Cape Town, and they were showing all these images of Cape Town. It's an illustration for a group called Muti, and people were like, that's what it's like. I was like, yeah, that's what it's like. I mean, but see, you can construct new, that you're saying, why does art matter? Because art constructs new ideas for people. But it's the beginning what Ben said, like it constructed new ideas. It was wonder.
Right.
And so you can choose the ones you pick.
Right, because I also think this is also a tab on colonization that hopefully museums can work with, is that if we only show the past, then we think of people as living in that time. But if we show them now, then we can talk about what they're doing now and how they are. But I think that's also kind of like some American like exceptionalism in that we know and they don't. But I think that, I mean, right, because people, when you think of things like Mongolia or Africa or even different parts of Africa, and especially when we're not talking about like places like South Africa, but when we're talking about the Congo or we're talking about Tanzania, people just think wild and jungle and whatever. And I'm saying that knowing that that's just not true, right? Or we say like, oh, this, we only know certain countries as being like forward thinking, or we think about them that way, but because that's how our history books will tell us, and that's honestly to some degree how our museums have told us. But if we are engaging with things now, we could be
like, you don't collect 19th century Italian landscapes. Like, why would you collect those? Is really the thinking, right? Because that's not a height of that art in that period. Absolutely. But I also think it's this idea, it's about centering who's being centered in this story, right? Like I think about you think about an ex, right? Like that ex's life ideally has ended when you walked away. Right?
All of my exes are dead.
Right? Like, nothing good has happened. They've never gone on vacation later. But that's really what what art history is. You know, when I said the thing about the 19th century, why did I say that? Well, because the art history establishment decided that after, you know, the Rococo era, it was all about France. Right? And like, if you're not in this field, you're like, well, why do you make those choices? And that's where, again, every time I want the public to be like, why did this happen? I want them to be critical thinkers and say like, hey, that's a bad choice. Why'd you do that? Maybe there is some great Italian, like, or whatever,
right.
You know. And I think, to me, the biggest thing I hope people say is like, who's telling the story and why? Like, I have a major problem right now in the art world, because repatriation is part of it, and so they're trying to find new, you know, ethnic stories, basically, because repatriation is coming, right? And but then they don't necessarily want to see the power of the person telling the story.
So that's kind of my question too, right? Like, that was the kind of question we were going into in these, who are these curators? And I know, I mean, there was a big kerfuffle, as I'll use one of my my elementary school words that just sounds really fun to say, but kerfuffle in the Brooklyn Museum a few years ago with a curator of African art as a white woman. And now she had some I don't want to call her out, but she had some people who were supporting her, because I think she went to school at Columbia, who were saying she did this work and she should be able to curate. And then others were like, we're just so tired of having other people tell our stories where we can tell our own stories. So I wanted to get, and Ben, if you had anything to add to that, I want to get your thoughts on that when we're talking about curating certain types of art, ethnic art, and who should be doing that and why.
So I would say
go ahead, Seema.
So I'd say that one of the challenges, I will say, from the opposite, is that I remember when I was in grad school, I had wanted to study, actually, and I ended up studying it, but I wanted to study Western art. I was really excited in the art of what's called the Low Countries, what's, you know, now the Netherlands. And but then people were like, oh, but you're going to get a job if you study Asian art, because you're Asian. And I will say, and I've had a lot of students over the years, grad students, who are, you know, ethnically something. They're Black, they're, you know, East Asian, they're Indian, whatever they are. And people have said to them, you should study your people. And I understand that, because I do understand that I might tell a different story. I was raised nominally Hindu, so I might tell a different story about those things than somebody who isn't. So I understand why the field needs that. But I think as a practitioner, to be siloed in that way is very hard as well. So I would say that, yes, I do think that stories should be told by own voices. And yes, I believe in that. But I also feel for anybody who's in the field who maybe wants to tell a different story. You know, who wants to study, like me, I wanted to study actually, you know, like something that was not of my ethnicity. And I do think that one of the things that's hard for people of color is that we're already being siloed in many ways, and so
our story's being told for us by different
and then we're being forced to tell this other story. Maybe you don't want to tell that story, so that part is true. So that's just my take on it. That said, I think the opposite is also true. These institutions have spent so many years, hundreds of years, and frankly still doing it. You know, there's a museum I know right now that has a complete gallery of Black artists there's not a Black person who worked on it.
And to me, it's really interesting because it's not as if you can't have, I think it also comes into the same thing when we're talking about appropriation, right? If there was more equitable exchange, maybe this wouldn't be a problem. But if that's the only face I see, and that's the person who's getting the work, becomes the problem, right? So I had this conversation recently with someone about, right, like who's doing the telling of the story. Like, I don't want my story told through someone else's lens. And I think about that. But I also think that so I think when we're thinking about curators, if there's only one curator to every exhibit, that's a problem, right? Because maybe there are white children, other children who can learn this story from that person, but there should always be an exchange. There should always be more of a group effort. Yeah. And I think that becomes a problem, because I will tell you, when I saw that story, I was pissed. I was just like, what? Especially because it happens to, and I'll speak from my experience from Black people. It happens in our music, it happens in our art, it happens in our food. What becomes popular, what becomes mainstream. Like right now, it's happening on the internet with AAVE, what used to be known as Ebonics and now is known as African American English or vernacular English. When I hear people say it's Gen Z speak or Gen Z slang, it boils the blood to the top of my head and out of my ears like a cartoon character. Yeah. So to see it through the lens of a person who didn't experience it, I think can be really, really hard, especially for the public. And I don't want to say that you can't study something, but bringing back to another thing, I had a conversation with someone recently. It was kind of a contentious conversation about who should be the person in the front. Right. Yes. And my problem isn't that. So I was talking to a person about a person who identifies as LGBTQ. And they were saying, well, as long as you're helping, it doesn't matter to me. And I said, see, and that's our fundamental difference. Because for me, I, as a Black, cisgender, Black, heterosexual woman who does work in DEI, would not be the CEO, the executive officer, or whatever of an LGBTQ organization. I wouldn't. That does not mean that I wouldn't work there. I wouldn't write the speeches for this person. But I think there's something to folks who look like you, folks who lived experience tell their own story, because I still think then it's infantilizing. Even if it's not like you, even if it's not like you gatekeeping or you not telling the story correctly, it still feels like I'm telling you what you need to know. And especially as a curator, if you're building the education and that kind of things for people, it's still not the people who did it. So that really, and I'm not going to, it feels very, the museum kind of has this thing like where to me it looks like, oh, well, we have Black friends in this gallery here, but
a lot of museums are using their Black friends in the galleries. Absolutely. I will say, I think part of the thing is it's about power. So the way the museums work is there's a curator who usually reports to the director, and they're the person who has the oversight largely on what goes into galleries, what exhibitions are put in. They work on a team usually with an interpreter. So I'd be that person in this role, and I help shape the message. So like, for example, at one of the projects I just worked on, one of the things I feel very strongly about is if you're going to say the race of a non-white artist or person in a label in a room, then you better say white for the other one. We don't use it as a blank, right? You don't get to say like blank art, like it's not implied, right? You don't have it as like the silent white.
Right. That's like white is universal and everything else needs a name.
So I don't, for example, that's the kind of thing I would do. That's an interpreter. But the curators have an enormous amount of power. They, for example, purchase the art. The directors obviously have to sign off on it. And actually the Met is into huge repatriation problems right now because they have works that are contested that they claim that they had nothing to do with, that are from Egypt. And actually the head of the Louvre has been called up. There's an active police case about it. And it's because, the problem about repatriation is and the problem with art museums, it's all about money. It is the largest unregulated market in the world. Right. And so it's all about money. Now, the opposite, the curators also have this incredibly important power to return works. And at CMA, what happens usually is it's all through diplomatic channels, right? Like you go from country to country, then it trickles down to these curators. But they, Cleveland, they've given back works.
Yeah.
And it's really it's high stakes. I mean, you're in the building, something's happened, but you don't do it. I'm too little. I was too peonish to be able to help with that. But,
I know, and it feels very much like a movie where you're like, and
I will say what had happened when I was at CMA, there was all these code words people have been talking about. I was like, what's a refrigerator? What are we talking about?
the raven is leaving the building.
The what?
But I think it's important.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ben.
Well, I guess it was building a question Tychelle mentioned about exchange. So I'm wondering, Seema, can that be a form of what repatriation looks like? Because I read a story, was looking at a museum that I think they were having objects. I don't know if they were funerary objects, but objects I think tied to death and mourning. And the way they were describing the objects or people, someone from this community who these people are still alive, that's incorrect. And so it wasn't so much them returning the objects as it was bringing that community to the museum and working with them about here's how to actually write about it, here's how you display about it, and with them they've given this group, I guess the privilege of being able to access it in ways maybe the public. So I thought, oh, what a neat way where maybe in this case sending an object back, it truly doesn't work, but here they found this other way of an exchange where they're brought
it's
in.
happening slowly but surely. I know with First Peoples groups, they've done a couple of cases in Canada and Vancouver. They've done some stuff here in the States, and I think absolutely, though I will say that I think funerary objects is one of those ones, like religious objects, that honestly, if they can't take it back, then I also don't know that it should be displayed. There's a lot of works that museums historically displayed that they shouldn't. And I think working with groups, there's a lot of museums that are starting to think hard about that and making better choices. But you also said, I think, a really important word, something that has happened for a long time, actually, since like I've been in the field, but much longer than me. Certainly there's cases in the 80s and 90s, trade. So like we shouldn't have had this one, but maybe we can like buy that one. So you return the thing and then you purchase something, because it goes back right to the fact that there was, and I think that that's really important. There was an initial theft. There was an initial really egregious thing that happened.
Right. And it's,
go ahead, Ben.
I was just saying, I'm so glad we have you with the Seema, because I think when we're talking about it, it's certainly something I think that maybe, time can certainly move slowly. And I think with larger institutions, like it takes decades, maybe in centuries for something to happen. So it'll be interesting to see what will this look like near the end of the century. Because I'm thinking too, like on a wider scale, that report, I think it was 2018, that the French president commissioned with like French museums, and on the national French museums on holding objects that came from illicit or dubious means. And that was 2018, so just 4 years ago. So I'm curious, and it's more just a thinking out loud, like what will the impact of that on like this international scale be, come the year 2100 or something like that.
I mean, I also think too, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, Seema, like the economic impact, because we talked about how much money this is in museums, how much it can have an impact on the places that it came from, to give back, sell back, buy back, all of these things, and then buy from those places now, I think is an incredible economic, thing that we can engage in. And I think that's a really interesting. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
No, I think both of those are tied. I mean, I don't know, right? Like, because we have economic crises and we have climate change and all these other things. But let's like imagine in the most ideal world that if everything went back to where it was from, and new things came to the West, like if it was a more equitable trade, how those both countries would do better. Like, do you know what I'm saying? Like, actually, you could do it in a way where you had economic impact on both sides, where there isn't an uneven economic impact. So I mean, I think it's very feasible. The question really is, the thing I fear about museums is that the structural change that would be required to make them equitable means that the people who are in power now would have to lose power. And their amount of power is so great. Right now, what they're ceding is only they're just pretending to give you power. By putting up a gallery, by having white curators curate a gallery of Black artists, is showcasing that they are, it's like somebody who's saying, I am diverse. I'm into diversity. We're transparent. We're transparent. You're like, okay, you are.
Right.
Oh, sorry, I do interrupt, but I was thinking too of even with, I think of with similar but different, the issue, like with when you look at the opioid crisis in the country and the Sackler family, and how long, it wasn't until a couple years ago that the Met, we'll name them, and other museums have decided, after careful thought, we decided to make the right choice to remove their name. It's like,
and it's crazy because like they still have so many Sackler things. There's the Sackler. I mean, part of the problem is this is also all about like the people who gave the art to the British Museum couple hundred years ago, many of those families are probably still incredibly wealthy. Right. You know, the Sacklers were very wealthy long before the opioid crisis, and a lot of Asian collections. I know that when I was working at the Cleveland Municipal Art, there was Sackler donated things. Almost any Asian collection in this country has a Sackler tie. I was looking at on my TikTok. I have it, so if ever anybody wants to look at it, there's a scene where I don't know which one, but one of the James Bond movies where who's the blonde hunky James Bond? I can't think.
Daniel Craig.
Daniel Craig is sitting in he's sitting in the National Gallery with Q, and they're sitting in the Sackler room, which has now finally the name has come down, but it's everywhere.
Wow.
The V&A, when I was in London, I don't know, in 19 or just before COVID, the V&A had just opened this beautiful ceramic atrium. It's an exterior space that's called the Sackler.
Yeah, you can always tell like who has the amount of money when you see their names on something, and you're like, oh, your name's on this, money, school, this school, that thing, that museum, So I went to a museum in Philadelphia, and I saw a room named after a family that worked at that their kids went to the school that I worked at, and I was like, oh, y'all got museum room money. Oh, that's different money, right? Like that kind of thing. So
right, because I'm thinking too, if you can give money to a museum, I believe, does that count as like a tax deductible donation? So when it comes to your tax, it's like charitable giving, but it's really good for you when you have to file your income taxes the year after.
Absolutely. And you know, the funny thing is about charitable giving taxes, I learned this year because I was one of there's annually groups of museum professionals advocate for museums on the federal level. So we go to all the senators' offices. Right now we're doing it virtually. And this year, one of the things that we were advocating for was changing the way, so the tax break, I think it started in like 1917-ish. And so it's not actually, so people were giving before, right? The Philadelphia museums you were talking about, that was before. The New York museums was before. Even the Cleveland Museum of Art was before. It was started in 16. So, but that until just recently, you've had to be able to itemize. You'd basically have to have a tax bracket and basically an accountant, right? The idea was that only the super wealthy get to take this tax break. So they were trying to say, can we do it for people who also just pay like blanket? You know, like you just do like, I earn this much, I have this deduction. You know, like the regular, you know, I do my own taxes kind of people. They're trying to change that, which shows you how tied to kind of writing off wealth museums are. They are completely like a tax break for people.
Right. There's a few different institutions. We don't have enough time to start talking about churches as well, but you know, the different things.
Yeah.
But it is so interesting, and I think I think about the, you know, who's telling the story, how it gets told, what history, and then what kids are learning. Because if we are having certain curators and we're showing certain art and we're supplementing education through museum visits, because every kid has been to a museum through school, that's who gets to tell what story, right? And I just think so much of it is tied in together. Yeah,
such a great point. I mean, museums, I always have maintained, is the second largest educating arm of K-12 audiences. If you think hard about it, who is it? Who are they learning from?
Right.
Like, yes, you could say TV, TikTok, but you know, a lot of those sources are discounted, right? So like your kid learns something on YouTube, they go to class, maybe the teacher's like, but that's not true. Let's go to a museum. The museums are sanctioned by schools. Yeah. And you're exactly right. Who's telling the story? Do they have the right to tell that story?
Are they telling the story correctly in
yes.
full? And it is funny because I mean, I worked in a Montessori school for 8 years, and I love that school. We would take the kids to if we needed something to do, we were going to go find someone to tell us about, and whether it was a book or whatever. And we took kids to museums all the time. So I think about who gets to tell the story. So we're coming up on like 5 minutes left. This conversation could go on forever, and I'm
honestly
like intrigued.
So
I've had like so many aha moments with casting and current art and all of those things. I want to ask Ben, do you have anything else you want to ask that won't lead us into another 20-minute conversation?
No more questions.
Okay.
I don't have questions like this now.
So I think my last question for Seema and our Brave Space our last question for you is: are people allowed to ask where things are from? Like, what do you want people to understand and know about museums and ownership and all of these things? Like, if you had to tell somebody who, okay, we won't use somebody, me. If you had to tell me walking into a museum what I should know, what I should do, what I should think about when I'm walking, besides the aha moments you already gave, what should I know? How should I be able to interact with that museum? What do you want people to know?
That's great. I think that the first thing is everyone should ask. It's your museum. Even if it's a private institution, it is the public space. Though it is the same as a library. If you think that you have any ownership of your library, if you have any ownership of your garden, you have ownership of your museum collection. So when you're there, and if something seems weird to you, like, where did that come from? The first thing you can do is look at the label. And so the label might say something like 5th century AD Syria, right? Now you can then say, like, hey, I know something about 5th century AD, or you can say, I don't. And then that's when you can ask people. I would guess that the front of house staff there might be overwhelmed. And so you don't necessarily have to ask them, but you can ask the info. Every museum, if you do info at that museum's email, that is probably their info email. And you should ask them. And you can also look to, because the other part of this is the money. Where's the money coming from? So if you look to see where the art was purchased from, usually either the very last line of the whole label or the last line of the very top before they start telling you a story is called the attribution, or it'll tell you about the funding. And it'll say John Smith Fund. Now, if it says the Sackler Fund and you have an issue with opioids, you ask them. But anybody who's given money, they have to say where it came from, where they purchased it from. Gift of the artist, gift of the X family. They say that. They say when it comes in, they usually say where it came from. So gift of the Sacklers, 2020.14. So that means that in 2020, the Sacklers gave you this. If it says gift of, that means they own the object and they gave it to you. If they say fund of, that means they gave them money to buy it and the museum chose it and bought it. My point is that there's a lot of information there about where the money's coming from and where the objects are coming from. And if you can't decode that, I said it pretty quickly. Certainly there's a lot of resources, but you know what? You don't need to. You don't need me. Just email those people. You could say at the desk, hey, especially if you're there on a weekday, a lot of the education and curatorial staff works weekdays. But, I'm really curious about this, and I have a personal vested interest, particularly if it's something that's culturally responsible, you're part of. It's your right. You know what? You either paid your ticket, you live in that city, whatever it is, you're the public. And they actually ask.
I'm going to be going in these museums asking
questions. I'm not ready to go with those little placards. I'm ready to go with those placards.
That's right. I was the responder to the info for many years. And before email, I'm old enough that I'm not old enough, but we had a lot of older visitors. We had comment cards. And I have to tell you, there was a woman who, if you were, you'd get a stack that you had to reply to, and she would say, have you replied to them? Did you call that lady back? And there was one woman, this is so funny. This poor woman had no answer phone, as she called it. She had no voicemail. And so, I just call her, all the time.
Once a week.
Because I had to answer her
number, you get a call.
Comment card. Yeah, but that's our role. That's, and museums actually want it. I used to get sometimes questions. I'd be like, thank you for asking me. I'd get a question about why something was in a label. And I'm like, oh my God, thank you.
I am going to start asking. You know what? I think, and I love this conversation because I'm going to start asking. I don't think I've ever thought to go into a museum and not just look as my husband and my mother-in-law do with their hands behind their back. They're like, So I'm going to start asking questions. That was the other thing I think we talked about as we were prepping is museums don't have to be this quiet, sterile space, that they should be some interaction.
Yeah.
No, they're a leisure space. That's what they're for, actually. They're for us to enjoy objects together.
Absolutely.
I'm
just enthralled with this conversation. I know the next time I visit Ben or he visits me, we're going to be going to museums together, asking questions, talking to people.
Nosy patrons.
Exactly. Exactly. So I just want to say, thank you so much for coming on and being here. You've taught us so much. and now we have to figure out a way to repay you, engage with you. So where can people tell us where people can find you,
Sure.
what socials you're on, so that people also can now ask you questions on your
Ask me all the questions. Ask me all the questions. I am easiest to find on Twitter, Artlust, or TikTok, Artlust, ARTLUST. And then all my other info is on there, so you can find my like email and all that other stuff. So
go follow Seema, because like
Seriously,
she just taught us so much more
Right.
than I probably learned going with my teachers in our museum. I was always a rabble rouser when I was going. I was like telling her I didn't believe dinosaurs were real in the natural history museums, but I loved it, and I can't wait to go to these museums with new eyes and new questions.
good.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. This has been a great conversation.
Awesome. And Ben, thank you for stepping in. We love this.
Oh my
I love
gosh,
having
this
this
is
conversation.
great.
He was a little nervous, Seema, so I didn't know.
Oh,
How do you feel?
I was a little terrified. Oh, thank you. I was a
no.
little terrified. You know what? Once we started talking, I'm like, oh, this is like
This is right up his alley.
Exactly.
You know,
Yeah,
I will
great.
say, Seema, what you don't know is like me and Ben have been friends for a while. He spoke at my wedding and was the most beautiful with I love hearing him speak. So it was so great. He got to speak. I was like handing out who was going to speak what at my wedding. And I was like, my friend Ben has to do one. He has to do one. So we're life friends. And now we have a new friend in Seema Rao.
Yes.
So thank you
Yeah, maybe
so
we'll
Thank
all
you,
go to a
Seema.
museum someday.
Yeah,
That
well,
would
if
be
I could go to a
awesome.
museum with you, like that's gonna be a different
my gosh,
experience.
that
It would be
would be-
so
yes.
awesome. Awesome.
Someday.
Amazing.
Awesome. Well, we'll see you all back in 2 weeks with our next topic, and maybe another producer on. We'll start getting our producers involved, and Mel will hopefully be back. I'm sure she'll be back in 2 weeks. And we'll see you here live again. You can find us on all platforms: Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, here live, and also Apple Podcasts. So I can't wait to talk to you all in 2 weeks, and we'll see you. Roll that outro. I don't know who does it, but roll the outro.